Good morning. Happy Sunday to all of you. I am very glad you're here. No part of the book of Revelation has caused more fear and speculation than the identity of the Antichrist, the nature of the mark of the beast, or the meaning of the number 666. More than any other portion of John's vision, these three elements continue to pop up in our cultural consciousness again and again and again. We see it in art. I mean, come on. How many movies have we seen by this point in which a little boy turns out to be the Antichrist, okay? It comes up all the time in politics. I remember back in the 90s when the European Union was being formed. And all of these nation states gathered together and they agreed to one government and they agreed to one currency. And I heard multiple messages preached on Sunday mornings in which they said, you know what? One world government, one world currency. The book of Revelation is being fulfilled in front of our very eyes. Get ready because Jesus is coming back any minute. With these symbols, the mark of the beast, 666, the Antichrist himself, they show up in discussions about science and technology. I mean, look, we're not going to get into this, but it was just a couple of years ago that there was a very vocal group of people that were saying that the COVID-19 vaccines were actually like secret microchip injections from Bill Gates to cause us to worship the Antichrist instead of the devil. I mean, these symbols really do show up a lot more often than we might at first realize. Now, the problem with shoehorning Revelation's imagery into every modern event that happens is that it confuses and diffuses what the text actually says. It confuses and it diffuses what the Bible communicates. It creates fear and division when, as we've talked about, the reason that the book of Revelation was written, one of the primary goals of the book is to create faith and unity among God's people, even in the middle of hard times, persecution, and uncertain futures. So this morning, I want to spend some time discovering what John the Revelator has to actually say on the subject of the Antichrist, and also what he doesn't say. How do we separate the truth of God's word from all of the other things that have accumulated through culture, from culture throughout time? And what we're going to discover today is that you and I need to be incredibly vigilant. We need to be watchful. We need to be wise when it comes to the Antichrist, but not for the reasons that you probably think. So, Revelation chapter number 12 and 13 is where we're going to start today. We are introduced in this passage to three beasts. I've got a little diagram here on the screen that might help to illustrate some of what we're taught in this particular passage. Now, these three beasts, we're going to speak of each one individually in just a moment, but they are often presented or understood as an unholy trinity, that they are a counterfeit and a mockery of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit. In Revelation, we see three characters that often are understood as this inversion of God's Holy Trinity, all right? I'm going to point out some symbolism as we read through the passages that are listed here on the screen, and you're going to pick up on how there are themes and elements that we understand to be true of the Trinity that find themselves or find its way here into this particular section as well. So the first beast is called a dragon. A dragon. Now, a dragon in the Bible is not a winged lizard, Game of Thrones style. Instead, it is a serpent. It's a snake. And you'll remember there is snake imagery all throughout the Bible, even going all the way back to the book of Genesis. And we're introduced to the dragon in Revelation chapter number 12, verses 1 through 11. I'm going to go ahead and read the whole passage for you. It's here on the screen so you can follow along with me. John says, "Then I witnessed in heaven an event of great significance. I saw a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon beneath her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant, and she cried out because of her labor pains and the agony of giving birth." Now, this woman is either going to represent Israel or Mary in particular. You'll see why. "Then I witnessed in heaven another significant event. I saw a large red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns with 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept away 1/3 of the stars in the sky, and he threw them to the earth. He stood in front of the woman as she was about to give birth, ready to devour her baby as soon as it was born. She gave birth to a son who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away from the dragon and was caught up to God and to his throne. So we know the child is a reference to Jesus, so the woman is either a reference to Mary, his biological mother, or to Israel, his national progenitor. The woman fled to the wilderness where God had prepared a place to care for her for 1,260 days. We talked about that time frame last week, and it pops up here as well. Then there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon and his angels. The dragon lost the battle, and he and his angels were forced out of heaven. This great dragon, the ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, the one deceiving the whole world, was thrown down to earth with all his angels. So we're plainly told in this passage that the dragon is Satan himself, the devil. The second beast that we're introduced to is in the next chapter, chapter number 13. We read about this beast in verses 1 through 7. Again, they're on the screen so you can follow along with me. John says, "Then I saw a beast rising up out of the sea." This beast comes from the sea. That's important. It had 7 heads and 10 horns with 10 crowns on each horn. And written on each head were names that blasphemed God. This beast looked like a leopard, but it had the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion. And the dragon, the first beast, gave this beast his own power and throne and great authority. I saw that one of the heads of the beast seemed to be wounded beyond recovery, but the fatal wound was healed. The whole world marveled at this miracle and gave allegiance to the beast. They worshiped the dragon for giving the beast such power, and they also worshiped the beast. "Who is as great as the beast?" they exclaimed. "Who is able to fight against him?" Then the beast was allowed to speak great blasphemies against God, and he was given authority to do whatever he wanted for 42 months. There's that time frame again. And he spoke terrible words of blasphemy against God, slandering his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. And the beast was allowed to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. We talked about that last week, all right? Now, this passage doesn't specifically name who this second beast is, but I'll go ahead and give you a spoiler. We understand this beast to be the Antichrist. Although that title or name is not specifically applied here in this passage, that is who John is speaking of. There's the third beast of the unholy trinity revealed in the same chapter, verses 11 through 18. I'm going to read this for you. Again, I really want you to understand how John is framing all of these characters. In verse 11, he says, "Then I saw another beast come up out of the earth." So the beast before came from the sea. This beast comes from the land. He had 2 horns like those of a lamb, but he spoke with the voice of a dragon. You see, there's a relationship between the beasts and the dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast, and he required all the people of earth to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. He did astounding miracles, even making fire flash down to earth from the sky while everyone was watching. In verse 16, we read, "He required everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be given a mark," there it is, "on the right hand or on the forehead, and no one could buy or sell anything without that mark, which was either the name of the beast or the number representing his name." Wisdom is needed here. "Let the one with understanding solve the meaning of the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Now, this final beast is often called, actually in the text, he's explicitly called the false prophet. So the unholy trinity consists of the dragon, the devil. It consists of the first beast, who is the Antichrist, and the second beast, who is the false prophet himself. Okay? In these 2 short chapters, we get 3 of the major symbols of the book of Revelation: the Antichrist, the mark of the beast, and the number 666. John is careful not to explicitly unpack all of these. He doesn't give us all the details. However, he gives us a lot of clues. And those clues are there intentionally so that the one with understanding is able to read and comprehend who and what he is referencing. In fact, in several places in the book of Revelation, he says things like, "This calls for a mind with understanding." Meaning, if you think about it, if you correctly interpret what he has written, you can know what it is he's talking about. The answers might require some deciphering, but it is possible to know. Now, all 3 of these things, whether we're talking about the unholy trinity or we're talking about the Antichrist himself, the number 666, and the mark of the beast, all of these things are interrelated, and when you solve one, you shed light on the other one, and it works its way around for each of those. Okay, so in order to uncover who the Antichrist is, because I'm going to tell you who I think the Antichrist is, and which government he works for, which country he lives in today, and I'll even give you his Instagram handle, okay? So you can go follow him just to stay up to speed. No, I'm kidding. All right. I am going to tell you what I think about the Antichrist here, but before we talk about the Antichrist, we need to talk about the concept of the Antichrist as it exists in the Bible. We're going to zoom out here and look at what the Scripture has to say. Now, Believe it or not, when the Bible uses the word Antichrist, or when it's speaking about Antichrist, the phrasing and the way that it's presented is almost always plural. Plural. It's not so much about an Antichrist in the Bible as it is about Antichrists. The Antichrist. Now, last week, so I go back after I preach every week. I go back and I listen to or I watch the message to make sure I didn't accidentally say anything heretical. And last week I didn't say anything heretical, but I did say something that was slightly untrue. My mouth got a little ahead of my mind, and I said last week, the Bible never speaks about the Antichrist. It only speaks about Antichrists, plural. That's not strictly true, and I want to make sure I correct that. I don't ever want to say something that's wrong and then be like, they weren't paying attention anyway, okay? So if you catch me on something like that, it's okay to say, hey, Dan, you said this, and you said it very strongly, but also there's this verse, so that's okay, and I always want to make sure that I correct myself. But what I can tell you with absolute certainty is that the Bible more often speaks of antichrists, plural, than it does the Antichrist, singular, all right? In 1 John, chapter number 2, verse 18, there is the first of 4 or 5 verses that specifically mention Antichrist. John, the same John who wrote the book of Revelation, says, "Dear children, this is the last hour, and as you have heard, the Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have come. This is how we know it's the last hour." In a few verses later, he says, "Who is the liar? It is whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ. Any such person is the Antichrist, denying the Father and the Son." Calgary's full of Antichrists, okay? There might even be some Antichrists in the room, but moving on. Now, the Bible does speak about a singular, specific Antichrist for sure. He is the epitome of all Antichrists, the one who is essentially the visible incarnation of his father, the devil. But in the Scripture, he goes by different titles, and in fact, the Antichrist is one of the least frequent that's applied to him. Instead, we go to books like 2 Thessalonians, and the Apostle Paul titles him the man of lawlessness. Or when we read in the book of Revelation, he is the beast from the sea. Or in John's epistles here, he is called the Antichrist. Okay, so there are many Antichrists who are epitomized by a singular one. One of the most interesting references to the Antichrist is from 1 John chapter number 4, verse 3. It's on the screen there. "Every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. That is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming and even now is already in the world." What's really interesting about this particular verse is that the grammar could mean that the Antichrist is already in the world when John is writing, or it could merely be the spirit of the Antichrist that exists in the world. And English translations are split on which of those is correct. Some will make it so that it's the Antichrist that is already present in the first century. Others will make it so that it's simply the spirit. Okay, let's circle back to Revelation. Let's talk specifically about the clues that John left for us regarding the Antichrist. I'm going to give you 6 or 7. And we're going to go deep on some of them. But I believe that when you combine all of these together, it gives us a very clear picture of who John had in mind when he writes about the beast from the sea. So the first clue that John leaves for us is that the Antichrist, the beast, is clearly associated with the Roman Empire. Clearly associated with the Roman Empire. We read about this in Revelation chapter 17, verses 9 and 10. I'm going to go ahead and read those 2 verses. They're there on the screen as always. This is what it says. John is writing, he says, "This calls for a mind with understanding." Okay, so this is that phrase again. Listen, pay attention. I'm going to give you a clue. You can figure out the clue if you'll pay attention. The 7 heads of the beast represent the 7 hills where the woman, the prostitute, rules. Okay, so remember, the beast had multiple heads, 7 in particular. And John says, I'm going to tell you what those 7 heads represent. They represent the 7 hills on which the prostitute rules. Okay. If you are familiar with Europe, if you're familiar with Italy, if you're familiar with ancient history, one of the defining geographical characteristics of the city of Rome is that it is built upon 7 hills. 7 hills. This is extremely well known, okay? This saying in ancient writings, Rome was often referred to as the urbs, as in like suburbs, right? The urbs septopolis, the city that was built on 7 hills. When you talked about a city on 7 hills in the ancient world, everybody knew you were talking about Rome. This is the equivalent of calling New York the Big Apple, or Scranton, the Electric City. What? All right, you know what I'm talking about, okay? Everybody understood the reference that John was making here. The 7 heads represent 7 hills on which the beast rules. Now he goes on, and he says this. Now pay close attention to this next line. This trips so many people up. John says they also represent 7 kings. Okay. John says the number 7 in regards to the beast represents the 7 hills upon which the beast rules, and it represents 7 kings that rule over that kingdom. So John uses imagery here that refers to the beast as a whole and to the kings individually over the beast. That means that when you read John talking about the beast, sometimes he's going to be referring to the beast in total, and sometimes he will be referring to one particular king or emperor that rules over that particular beast. Now, if you read Revelation from a futurist perspective, you believe that the Antichrist is going to be a king or an emperor of a revived Roman Empire. Okay, at some point in the future, Rome is somehow going to come back to power, and the Antichrist will rise up from within that particular nation. If you read it as a preterist, then you kind of look back and you say, John is speaking about a known Roman emperor from the past. Now, he goes on to say, 5 kings. So remember, 7 heads represent 7 hills, and also 7 kings. And then he says this in verse 10. 5 kings have already fallen. The 6th now reigns. Present tense, when he's writing, the 6th king is sitting on the throne, and the 7th is yet to come, but his reign will be brief. Okay. Now, I've told you guys that we want to take the Bible literally every chance we get. That our first way of approaching the scripture is that it is literal and it means precisely what it says, unless and until we have very good reason to interpret it symbolically or allegorically. So John has already given us a symbol, a beast with 7 heads. But then he gives us the meaning of the symbol, which indicates to us that we should probably take what he's saying here, not as another allegory or symbol, but as a literal truth that he is trying to communicate. He is getting very particular, very specific. He says there are 7 kings, 5 of whom have passed, the 6th reigns on the throne, and the 7th is yet to come. If we take him literally and we compare what he says to the ancient Roman emperors, this is what it looks like. The first of the Roman emperors was, of course, Julius Caesar, everybody's favorite, right? The second was Augustus. The third, Tiberius. The 4th, Caligula. He was a real bad dude. The 5th, Claudius. The first 5 have passed. The 6th now reigns, John says. The 6th of the Roman emperors was Nero, and the 7th is Galba. Now remember, we talked about this transition point from Nero, who committed suicide, power vacuum. Galba jumps in. He says, I'm the emperor. A bunch of other guys are like, no, you're not. There's a civil war that's fought here. And what I think is John's giving us some very clear and important clues about when the book of Revelation is written, first of all. I did my best to convince you last week that the book of Revelation was written in the mid to late 60s during the final moments of Nero's reign. And I want you to particularly notice that John says, the 7th has not yet come, but when he does, his reign will be brief. Galba reigned for 3 months. The dude barely got time to unpack his luggage inside of the royal palace, okay? This gives me goosebumps. I mean, I'm just like, wow. It's wild to me how accurate the book of Revelation is in all of its predictions. So, what I think is this particular section of Scripture offers us the first piece of evidence that when John speaks of the Antichrist, or the beast out of the sea, the second member of this unholy trinity, he is primarily referring to the Emperor Nero. Primarily referring to the Emperor Nero. In fact, just based on this passage alone, we could form a hypothesis. A hypothesis that John, when he speaks of the Antichrist, is first and foremost primarily referring to the Emperor Nero. Now look, it's a hypothesis. A hypothesis is not a conclusion. I'm not telling you, I've proved it, this is the truth, accept it. No, what I'm saying is, if this hypothesis is true, all the other evidence that we're going to read, the clues that John leaves for us, they all should apply to the Emperor Nero with great concord or clarity. And if any of them don't, then that would be evidence that John was not referring to Nero and perhaps to somebody else. Okay? All right. So the first clue that he gives us is that he is associated, the Antichrist is associated with the Roman Empire. Well, obviously Nero was, because he was the 6th emperor of Rome. The second clue that John gives us, Revelation 13:8, is that the Antichrist will be a man, not a woman, or a spiritual being. He specifically says he's a man. In 13:8, he says his number is the name of a man. Listen, we should be trying to elect as many women as possible if the Antichrist is still to come, because we know it's going to be a dude. So the more women we have in the top echelons of government, the less likely the Antichrist is going to come along the scene. I'm only half kidding about that. All right, so he's a man, not a woman, or a spiritual being. Nero clearly fits that bill. The third clue that we're given, John says, we know that one of the heads of the beast is wounded, so that it seems like the whole beast would die, but it somehow miraculously survives. You read about that. I saw a wound on the head, and the beast seemed to die, but miraculously it ended up surviving, and the whole world gave praise to the beast because it had performed this miracle. Now, the events of that particular passage very closely mirror the end of Nero's reign over the nation of Rome. So in 68 AD, after many, many years in power, the Romans had had enough of Nero. And he was declared by the Roman Senate as an enemy of the state, and he was sentenced to die by crucifixion. Now, this is a very, very surprising thing. Emperors were not killed. They were not executed this way, but they really disliked him so much that they were going to give him the worst death they had available to kind of give him his punishment or his just reward. Now, Nero refused to accept that sentence, and in fact, he was so scared that he was going to die by crucifixion that he basically chose to commit suicide before they could impose crucifixion on him for his death sentence. However, Nero couldn't bring himself to take his own life. And so Roman historians tell us, Suetonius in particular, tells us that when it came time for Nero to end and take his own life, he couldn't bring himself to do it, and so he commanded and demanded one of his servants to stab him in the neck, and his servant did, and Nero died that way. Pretty graphic, I'm sorry, but you kind of need to know that because it actually does impact the way that we understand John's prophecies here. Now, Nero dies. When he dies, the Roman Empire itself is plunged into chaos. The first of the Roman civil wars breaks out. I've told you, there are all these guys that start claiming the throne. They've all got parts of the army that are fighting for them. And so now the Roman legions are actually at war with one another. AD 69, the year after Nero commits suicide, is known in history as the year of the 4 emperors, because there were 4 men that ascended to and claimed the throne, but none of them held on to it for a few more months. It wasn't until Vespasian, the general who was down sacking Jerusalem, went back to Rome with a good chunk of the Roman army that he was able to claim the throne and then to stabilize the empire. You can read this for yourself. Historians are very, very confident that if Vespasian had not succeeded in his coup and claiming the Roman throne, the empire would have crumbled. There's no way that it could have survived. That year was so bad in Rome. It is often considered the worst until the empire itself eventually crumbled a few hundred years later. So John says, I saw one of the heads of the beast. Now, what did he already tell us? The heads represent the kings. He says, I saw one of the emperors take a wound that seemed fatal. It should have killed the entire beast. And for AD 69, for that year, it looked like the greatest empire the world had ever known was going to collapse in the matter of a few weeks or a few months. But somehow or another, this General Vespasian is able to stabilize everything, save the empire, and it goes on for many hundreds of years in the future before it eventually does collapse once and for all. Okay? The other interesting thing here is when you read this section, Revelation 13 rather, we're told that the beast makes war against God's people for 42 months. And it's within the context of this resurrection, this counterfeit resurrection that happens. That's when the beast then makes war. So when Nero dies, that's where we slot into the time frame, the timeline, I should say, the war against Jerusalem. All of that comports very, very well with what we've talked about. And so the counterfeit resurrection of the beast in Revelation 13, I also think points to Nero. Now, the fourth clue John gives us is that the beast, the Antichrist, is demonically possessed. Revelation 13:2, we're told that the dragon gives his power, his authority, and even his throne to the first beast. The beast is controlled by the dragon. So, if John is referring to Nero as the Antichrist, then we would expect Nero to behave in ways that would reveal he is demonically possessed. We would expect Nero to be a really, really evil guy. And boy, was he. All right. I'm going to share some details with you, and I got to tell you, what I'm about to share is very graphic. And if you have kids in the room right now, now's the time to make sure they put their earphones in. You might want to get up, wander out to the lobby for a couple minutes, because you don't want your young ones to hear what I'm about to say. Nero was, without question, one of the most depraved people to ever walk the face of the earth. He was a terrible, terrible man. Roman historians tell us that Nero killed his own mother, he killed his wife, he killed his own son, he killed his cousin, he killed more political opponents than we can possibly count. He was murderous at a level that very few people in history can even match. Nero is a very well-known rapist and pedophile. I'm not going to go into any details, but if you read about his sexual proclivities, it's some of the grossest stuff you could ever comprehend. He was also one of the greatest enemies of God's people in the last 2,000 years. You might remember that earlier in his reign, in the early 60s, there was an accidental fire that was started in the city of Rome. It got completely out of hand, and 70% of the entire city burned to the ground in the space of just a few days. Of course, the whole city is upset about this. They're blaming Nero. They're saying, Nero, you must have done something to anger the gods for them to allow this to happen. And so Nero shifts all the blame away from himself onto this little group called Christians. And he says, no. The Christians are the ones who are responsible for this. They don't worship our gods, and so the gods are punishing us for allowing them to live among us. Do you know that in the first century, Christians, when they were arrested and they were charged for their faith, they were charged as being atheists. That's what the Roman government called Christians. You guys are atheists because you are atheists. You are without our gods. So Nero enacts the first empire-wide persecution against Christians. It got terrible. He had them arrested, he had them tortured, he had them thrown in jail for years on end. He even had many of them martyred. We again read from Roman historians that he would take, this is hard to even say, he would take Christians and he would strap them to the top of giant poles and he would light them on fire to give light and heat for the Roman noble people while they had parties in the palace garden. My brothers and sisters suffered that ignoble death because of this terrible man. Again, the Roman historian Suetonius gives me what I think is probably the most jaw-dropping insight into who Nero really was. And I don't share this, guys, because it's so graphic or because it's so scandalous. You need to know who this guy really was. So Suetonius tells us Nero had a pastime in which he would take prisoners and political enemies. He would have them brought from jail or from wherever they were. He would have them stripped naked and tied up into the garden there at the palace. He would dress himself in the pelts and skins of wild wolves. He would have his guards place him inside of a cage and carry him into the garden. They would open the gate, and Nero, acting like a wild animal, would run out of the cage on all fours, howling, barking, and then biting and consuming the flesh of the people that were tied up in the yard. This is the emperor of the greatest country on earth. I mean, there are no words to describe that level of evil and depravity except demonic. That's it. John says the beast is given the power and the authority and the throne. All the evil, all the violence, all the hatred of the dragon himself is concentrated into the beast. And boy, does Nero fit that particular clue. Okay, clue number 5. John says we'll be able to count the number of the beast's name. And this is where we famously get 666. Now, there are a few things that you need to know about this number 666. First, and I would say most importantly, is that the number is not 666. The number is 666. Okay? 600, that's the way it's actually written. It's not 666. It's not 3 sixes in a row, but it is written in Greek as 666. This is really important because if you understand this particular nuance, it'll save you from making some false assumptions about who the Antichrist is. Back in the 1980s, it was fashionable in some Christian circles to say that Ronald Wilson Reagan might be the Antichrist because he had 3 names, all with 6 letters each. Ronald Wilson Reagan, okay? A more contemporary example, some of you might remember this. In 2014, there was a lady that went viral because she claimed that the logo for Monster Energy drink stood for 666. You guys remember this? She was everywhere, okay? And she said the M's look like the Hebrew letters that are 666. And she also pointed out that the slogan of Monster Energy drinks is Unleash the Beast. And so she went on this like talk show tour, and she went around everywhere she could. She was all over the internet basically saying somehow or another Monster Energy drink is a part of the Antichrist plan to grab a hold of the youth. All of that was because she didn't understand John said 666, not 666. She could have saved herself a whole lot of embarrassment, all right? So, well, and again, I'm not making fun of her, okay? I'm sure she's a sincere woman of faith. But, like, this is why it's important to correctly read the Scripture. It will prevent us from believing things that are not true. Okay, so what are we supposed to understand about this number? The first thing to realize is that in ancient languages, there were no written numerals. There was no 1, 2, 3. You know, we didn't have numerals in ancient languages. Letters stood in for numbers. And that seems very strange to us until you kind of think about it and you're like, oh, wait, we still do the same thing today with Roman numerals, right? My name, officially, is Daniel Webster Sweaza III. Thank you very much. That's my legal name. And in order to write out my full legal name, you write Daniel Webster Sweaza and then 3 capital I's because an I represents a 1, right? And so there are 3 of them. The letter V represents 5. The letter X represents 10. And then it gets on to M's and C's and V's, and none of us can remember what any of that means. So we're familiar with Roman numerals, letters representing numbers. And this is exactly how it was in the languages in John's day. Okay? So pay close attention here to what John says in chapter 13, verse 18. He says, wisdom is needed here. Let the one with understanding solve the meaning of the number of the beast. What this indicates is that the number is a cipher or a riddle. Okay? It is somehow occluded, it is somehow hidden, but it can be understood. If you will focus and pay attention, let's go back one slide. If you'll focus and pay attention, you will be able to make sense out of what it is that he's saying here. Now, part of the reason that John does it this way is because what he's writing is incredibly treasonous. The stuff that's contained in the book of Revelation, if Roman authorities understood what he was saying, if they understood that he was calling the Emperor Nero demonically empowered and a false leader, a false king and a false god, you better believe John's life, or any Christian who happened to have a copy of the book of Revelation would have been in dire trouble if they had been caught with it. So John then, he writes everything in an occluded way so that you can understand it, but it's not going to be immediately comprehended by some Roman official that's looking at whatever paperwork you might have on you at that particular moment, okay? Now, these sorts of puzzles in which numbers are represented by the letters of a name, they were very common in the ancient world. So in the Roman ruins of Pompeii, Amber and I have seen this for ourselves with our own two eyes. They have graffiti all over the place. Romans love graffiti, you guys. And so you go there, and in Pompeii, somebody wrote on one of the walls in Pompeii, "I love her whose number is 545." Okay, so he didn't want to write her name because it was a secret crush, secret admirer sort of thing. And so he uses a riddle that nobody's really going to understand, or it could apply to multiple people, so there's plausible deniability and all those different things. This sort of riddle via letters and numbers, very common. It's called Gataria. Again, you can look this up for yourself. Early Christians used Gataria quite a bit. So in the 1st and 2nd centuries, it was really common to say that the number of Jesus Christ was 888, which is obviously a play on the fact that the number of the beast is 666. But, interestingly enough, when you spell the name Jesus out in Greek letters, and then you add the representative numbers, it comes to exactly 888. So this is a very well-known thing. It's not like John is inventing something, or this is a one-off. This was very, very common in the ancient world. And so, if John is referring to Nero, remember the hypothesis, then we should be able to calculate this number, 666, so that it refers to Nero in some way. And what do you know? If you take the Greek manuscript that John wrote and you translate the number 666 into Hebrew characters, it spells out Nero Kaiser, which is exactly the way a Hebrew person would say Caesar Nero. Like, there have been all sorts of other ideas and theories that are put forth about what 666 means, how it's the number of his name. None of them are compelling, I think, in the face of this particular understanding. All you have to do is translate from Greek to Hebrew. Understand John is writing to a Greek-speaking Hebrew audience, people with, they're Jews living in the 1st century that are spread about the Roman Empire. And this would have been a very easy clue for them to comprehend. But it wouldn't have been easy for some Roman soldier. He doesn't speak Hebrew. If he came across this, he wouldn't be able to solve the riddle, so to speak. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, I mean, that's interesting, I guess. But couldn't it also be coincidence? Isn't it also possible, like if you translate it from Greek into a different language, then it would be somebody else's name, or it would be nonsense. So we can't be certain that John was actually codedly referencing Nero, right? Well, actually, I think there's another piece of strong evidence that kind of seals the deal. So now let's put the next one on the screen. If you're reading in Revelation chapter number 13, and you read verse 18, you might notice that there is an asterisk at the end of the number, or a footnote at the end of 666. So again, his number, the number of his name is 666, but there's a footnote. Anytime you see a footnote in the Bible, guys, you need to go down and read it, because it will often provide helpful information or cross-references or something like that. So when you look at that footnote in the Bible, you'll notice it says some manuscripts read not 666, but read 616. Well, what's that all about, right? Like, were like the scribes, were they wrong? Were they confused? Did they make a mistake? And now the riddle is kind of goofed up and we can't be absolutely certain? Nope. It's really fascinating. So there are two languages that are primarily spoken in the Greek Empire at this time. The eastern half of the Roman Empire. The eastern half of the Roman Empire spoke Greek, and the western half of the Roman Empire spoke Latin. So, what if we didn't take the Greek manuscript and translate it into Hebrew letters and come up with 666? What if we took the Latin manuscripts and we translated them into Hebrew letters? What would we get? You get 616, which again spells out Nero Kaiser, Nero, Caesar Nero. Okay, two independent strains of manuscript evidence that lead us to the conclusion that the guy John is specifically referring to is Caesar Nero. The odds of those things happening coincidentally are like vanishingly small. I mean, it seems very, very clear to me that if you want to solve the number, the riddle of the number of his name, 666, it will lead you back to Caesar Nero. Okay, one more clue that's provided regarding the beast's identity, and it involves the very infamous mark of the beast, the mark of the beast. Revelation 13, we're told that the false prophet requires everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be given a mark on their hand or on their forehead, so that no one could buy or sell anything without that mark, which is the number representing his name. Now, throughout the last century, I mean, this has been true throughout the last 2,000 years, but over the last century, there have been all kinds of things that people have been like, that's the mark of the beast. When social insurance numbers came out, everybody, your great-grandparents were like, that's the mark of the beast, I know it, I'm not getting one. When credit cards came out, there were all these Christians that were like, it's the mark of the beast. Look at those numbers stamped on the front of that card. Tattoos, barcodes, subdermal implants. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Basically anything that bears even the remotest possible resemblance to what's written in this particular passage. People are like, that's it. That's the mark of the beast. I knew it was finally going to show up. But you've got to pay attention to what John says. John says the mark of the beast is actually representative of the number of his name. So whatever this mark is, it's got to be in reference to the beast himself. It's got to be reference to his name and his particular number. If Nero is the Antichrist, as our hypothesis suggests, then we would expect the mark of the beast to relate to Nero in some way. Now, we're given two details about the mark. Two details we're told in the book of Revelation. The first is that it is needed to buy and sell. You cannot buy and sell without having this particular mark. The second is that the mark is received on the hand or on the forehead. The English word mark is translated from a very familiar Greek word, charagma. Charagma is that Greek word you see, and it means stamp, image, or brand. Stamp, image, or brand is what it means. And again, it's a famous word in ancient Greek. We understand it from within the Bible and from without. Its primary reference was to the stamp of the image on Roman coins. The stamp of the image on Roman coins. I'll put some examples that are here on the screen for you. You see two coins that have a charagma, a mark on them. Okay, the first is a charagma of the Emperor Nero. Nero was like the consummate neckbeard, man. If you see photos of him, his beard was like, that was not cool then, it's not cool now, but he rocked it, that's for sure. Okay, so this is a Roman denarius featuring Nero, Caesar. You see that on the left side. Augustus, that's his family name over there, or his title rather, over there on the right side, okay? So this is the mark that Nero had, the charagma that bore his image, his name, his face, okay? Now, let's go back to the Roman war against Jerusalem for just a moment. When the Jews rebelled against Rome, they had a long-standing issue with Roman money because Roman money had the face of the emperor on it. And you couldn't use money that had the face of the emperor on it inside of the temple. That's why there were money changers at the temple. Remember, there was this whole issue with Jesus and the money changers, and they were changing over from Roman coins to Jewish coins so that we didn't have blasphemous images and statements being given to God's holy temple. Okay, so when Jerusalem rebels against the ancient nation of Rome, they decide, we don't even want your money anymore, and so they stamp, they mark, they mint their own coins at that time. So when Nero hears, not only have they rebelled and fought against the soldiers and the army, he also hears that they've minted their own money, and in that moment he outlaws all Jewish provincial coins. Roman provinces, far-flung places in the empire, they could use official Roman coins, and they could also use their local provincial coins. But when Jerusalem rebels, Nero outlaws Roman coins so that you could only buy and sell using the things that had the mark, the stamp, the image, the brand of the beast, Nero, and his empire. Now, if that's the case, then what about this second part? That, if the stamp refers to the face of Nero on coins, which are required to participate in the Roman life and economy, then what about this part about, the mark being on your face or your hands? What about that? Because, you hold a coin in your hand, so that kind of makes sense. I guess I get that. But it doesn't really comply. Nobody's walking around with a coin on their forehead. So what exactly does this mean? Well, this is another one of those times where we want to ask the question, where else does something get placed or attached to a hand or a head in the Bible? And if you do, there is one very, very clear example of something that is placed both on the hand and on the head. If we go all the way back to the Old Testament, Deuteronomy chapter number 11, verse 18, Moses commands the people to commit yourselves wholeheartedly to the words of his message. And he says, tie them to your hand and wear them on your forehead as reminders. Now, in ancient times, observant Jews, actually in modern times too, observant Jews have taken this literally. And so I can put a picture here on the screen of something called the tefillin. And the tefillin is a black box that is worn strapped around the head when observant Jews go to morning worship. And it also includes a black box that's put on the arm, and then the straps are wrapped all the way around the hand. Inside of the black box are a series of scriptures that are designed to remind the Jews of God's promises of faithfulness and his past deliverance. Now, there's no, it's not coincidence that the mark from the beast is in some way parallel to the mark that God had given his people. Now, before I explain this, I want to be super, super clear, okay? We're not doing any racism today, all right? I am not saying that the tefillin are the mark of the beast. That's not it in any way, shape, or form. Rather, remember how I've told you, the unholy Trinity is counterfeiting the Holy Trinity and the work of the Holy Trinity. We've seen a counterfeit resurrection. We've seen a counterfeit relationship between the three members. Here we see a counterfeit marking. It is a marking that follows the same general pattern that God has used on his people throughout the centuries, but instead of keeping his promises and his word close to them, it keeps the ways and the systems of the beast itself close to them. John is saying there are a lot of first century Christians and first century Jews that rather than being marked and identified by God, rather than being marked and identified by the Lamb, they've allowed themselves to be marked and identified by the evil beast and empire that they were supposed to avoid the entire time. This is really complex, beautiful, clever imagery that he's using here. And when you start to put all of these clues together, and there are others, I don't have time to share them, but when you start to put them all together, to me, it seems very, very clear that the Antichrist, the beast of Revelation that's spoken of by the Apostle John, is almost certainly the Emperor Nero. To me, that's the conclusion that I draw. Now, I'll tell you again, just as I have many times over, if you disagree and you think it's some guy yet to come, that's okay. I'm not trying to fight with you. You might be right. I might be wrong. It's not that big of a deal. But we can talk about it. We can work through and study, and we can even debate and discuss if we want to. But this is the conclusion that I have come to, and I think it makes the most sense out of John's writings. Remember what I told you back in week 1 of this series. Revelation was not written to unveil how the world ends. Revelation was written to unmask how the world runs. John is unmasking the evil empire that Christians have to live among, but they cannot identify with. Do you understand? That same message is applicable to us today. Like I get so worried, I don't anymore, I used to. I get so worried about accidentally taking the mark of the beast at some point in the future and, somehow being condemned. And God is saying to me, there is a beast. And the beast was Nero, but the beast is every empire that puts itself in opposition to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The beast is every economy that demands that you participate in unethical and dishonest practices in order to get ahead. The beast is every political system that promises to provide to us what only God can give. At any point that I find myself putting my trust in wealth, health, power, or idols, do you know I am bearing the mark of the beast? So this is a warning. This is a warning to us that we have got to be so intentional that we live our lives focused on the Lamb and not on the beast. We read the book of Revelation, and the beast seems so big, powerful, terrible, all-encompassing. The people who worship him say, who can fight against the beast? Who could stand against the beast? And we could be so consumed by fear, so consumed by speculation, that we find our mind totally transfixed by the beast. That is not why the book of Revelation exists in the Scripture. The book of Revelation exists not so that you would see the beast, but so that you would see the Lamb. I know it sounds ridiculous to think that a lamb could win a battle against a dragon. But come on, somebody, one has. I love the way Revelation chapter number 17, verse 14 says it. The dragon and his beast wage war against the lamb, but the lamb will defeat them. For he is the Lord of all lords. He is the King of all kings. And his called and chosen and faithful ones will be with him in his victory. So I don't read about the beast and get real worried. I'm wise. I'm as wise as a serpent. I understand how the world works. I'm as harmless as a dove. I don't participate in the beast's schemes. I like what the scripture says, 1 John chapter number 4, verse 4. Greater is he that is in you, he that's in the world. The power of the Lamb is greater than the power of the beast. The words of the Lamb are truer than any words the beast is whispering in your ear this morning. The plans of the Lamb are better than the plans of the beasts. And the followers of the Lamb will ultimately be stronger than the followers of the beasts. So don't let yourself be consumed with fear over the power of the beast. Let your mind be fixed on the Lamb who was dead but lives forevermore. Focus on the Lamb who in meekness overcame the violence of the dragon. Focus on the Lamb who shares his victory with everyone who puts their faith in him. Jesus, we crown you as the Lamb, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who will eventually experience total victory. Every enemy will be placed under your feet. You will redeem, reconcile, and renew all things according to your good and perfect plan. And that includes us. And so we celebrate today knowing that the dragon and the beasts, they have no power over us. But instead, we already carry your victory, your mark, your stamp, your seal every single day. So I pray, God, that we would trust in you. We would follow you. We would worship you as the only one who will save us. Thank you for your victory. Thank you for sharing your